And welcome to ESO Daily. I'm your host, Mysticraven. Alright guys, so sometimes I take a little time out and I kind of go over number crunching, especially what I'm seeing in patch notes, what I've seen in PTS, and what's currently going on live. And there's no easy way to like break this down, but I'm going to say it. What's currently going on with Night Mother's Gaze and Sunderflame on PTS is scary for stamina DPS. Because the balancing act between penetration becomes a little excessive, right? And I'm going over like a ton of number crunching, and I'm like, there's no way to equal the amount of difference between the swap. There's no way in the current configuration that they're planning on implementing. So you're going to either be short on one end or overextended on the other. It's just, it's concern, because over penetration is loss of DPS, under penetration, loss of DPS. And it's like, at this point, I'm like, there's no indifferent value to adjust the swap. What ZOS needs to do. Now, I'm giving what they should do. They're not necessarily going to need to do it, or they might not do it, period. But what they should do is bump sharpen trait. Okay, so let's discuss why potentially we're looking at the sets being offsetted. First, we have to take a look at the Ravager set, which is typically a heavy plate set. With Jory crafting in place, we're going to be able to literally adjust those jewelry traits and make a set like Ravager completely insane, right? It's going to be nuts. You add Nerdhole into that, and then guess what? It scales off of weapon damage percentage. It's massive. It's actually really big. Let me check out the comments here and whatever else I have you. So, give me a second here. Loading up my stuff. All right. Sorry about that. Yo, Josh, yeah, because I was going over them. Looks like they are buffing Hearseys. A dev posted a pic on Twitter yesterday. Cannot remember his name. Got you. Hearseys is a good set. Underestimated. I got it, but I have yet to implement it in a build. But, okay, they need to buff sharpen. Why? Okay, the first thing I want to explain here is penetration values, right? And in different curves. Very, very important. But when we take a look at like, the passive towards Twin Blade and Blunt, Maces ignores 5% of an enemy's physical resistance, right? Same thing with like the two-hander. When we look at the 2H passive, Maces ignores 10% of my target's physical resistance. Now, heavy weapon, when you get into this, you can ignore up to 20% of a physical resistance, right? Of 20% of 18,240, that's 18,200, that's 3,640 off the top of penetration. Now, so if I wanted to go with two-hand mace, right, I could ignore some of a big chunk of penetration. But here's the major problem with that. Sharp, even if I make the bow sharpen, I'm only getting 2,600 and something, which will shorten my penetration value on bow side. Same thing with maces. If I go with two maces, I'm getting 20%, and I'm still short on the bow side, even if I use sharpen trait. Now I could take up the lever, right? But I'm playing a balancing act that has no indifferent value to it. That becomes the problem. So what's that going to do? It's going to pigeonhole the builds into using penetration set, either Spriggans or back to Two Fang Serpent. It has to happen, because even though I wish they would put the minor force on the Night Mothers, instead of the Sunderflame. Because even with the 2H splash damage, I can affect up to 4 targets with the splash damage to get that minor force, right? Cool. Or minor fracture, not minor force. Minor fracture. So I can apply the minor fracture. It's like, oh, okay. Cool deal. Cool deal. But it would be better suited on Night Mothers because any damaging effect could apply that, right? And then offset Sunderflame and decrease the value. I understand why they're doing it, because if you put a penetration set with something like Ravengers and then put Nirnhone, it would completely be OP as hell. It just would. But they need to close the gap between the margins, between the penetration value for stamina users. Magicka users get a flat value in their passives, right? Not so much on penetration sets. That's why it's scary. It's becoming a very, very scary thing. So it's just saying, hey, you're going to have to use either this, that, or this. Those are your options for stamina players. It becomes a problem. It becomes very, very scary. So someone will actually use it. Yeah. I believe the Hereseas buff is to make up for the Sunder and Night Mother's debuff. Well, yeah, but Hereseas does a stam return. It has a flat value for stam return. And I love the idea behind it, but the problem of it is most DPS won't use it because it sacks damage. I love it. I think it's great. Like, if they would have made that a tank set initially, it would have been like badass. Like a good tank support set, it would be badass. Problem of it is, it's a medium armor set, and hence why a lot of people like kind of frown on it. It's like, oh shit. That's the problem with it. It's a great set, but nobody wants to use it because of the lack of it shortens their DPS. They're not thinking about group functionality. But you're right. It's already a good set. If they buff it, it's going to make it better. That's for sure. And I agree with that. Totally. I mean, any improvement's good. Problem of it is, our player's going to use it. That becomes the issue. That becomes the issue, you know? And for me, personally, as I'm going through the numbers, I'm trying to close the margin, right? I'm trying to close the margin with the patch notes, what I'm seeing, and I'm like, it can't be done because there's not enough indifferent value between the two numbers. It's a huge gap. Like, I'm talking like 1,200 gap between the two. And it's like, oh shit. So it's like you have to end up using a flat value between the swap, because if you use maces or you use sharpen traits, you lose on the swap value. It's like, okay, so what are we supposed to do? So they should, I'm not saying they shouldn't go through with what they're intending to do. I'm just saying they should buff up sharpen to an indifferent value. Is what should happen. They need to change poison inject. I think it's to help with stamina in trials and such. Yeah, definitely. That's what it was intentionally for. It was a trial set originally, prior to 1 Tamriel. I hate that skill. Oh, you hate poison injector? Dude, that's what I'm trying to level right now. I love poison injector though, Josh. Love it. But yeah, so like I'm going over the number crunch and I'm just like, we got a major problem here. We have a major problem, because if someone wanted to offset their sets and use maces for penetration for PvE build, well, now they're going to have to use sharpen on the bow. That's if they go bow. Most likely that's the typical configuration. Problem of it is there's a loss between the swap for penetration, so DPS will deviate. And I'm like, okay, time out. So how do we rectify something very minute if they continue to go with Night Mothers and Sunder? Simple. Buff sharpen. You know, it's just that simple. I mean, don't have to make it difficult. But honestly, to me it's a little scary, because as I'm going through it, I'm a typical type of person who believes that, you know, you can do builds based on numbers and you can make up those numbers. And most of the time you can, but given the fact that we're missing debuff sets, or they're getting nerfed for Stam, that becomes a major problem with the configuration. And I understand why they're doing it, but how do we make up those values? Something has to get buffed along the line if they're going to continue, because it's just too much of a deficit. It's just saying, hey, you're either going to have to wear a penetration set. Well, given the fact that there's a very limited options in penetration sets, we're looking back at like going to Two Fang or having to go to Spriggans. Those are our options. So it's like, or use the Lover and the Sharpen, and then have those flat values on both sides without maces, and that can be done. But once again, it just shortens the leash. Like I literally was talking to somebody. I'm like, what's the point of making maces have a penetration value when it's not equivalent to the trait? That to me becomes questionable. It's like, okay, I understand it's 20%, but if we do the math, right, we know the flat value for a cap on PvE. Question of it is anybody going to be able to do it successfully? No, because back bar is going to be a loss, or if you overcalculate, now you're overpenetrated slightly on maces. And it's like, okay, so where did this all, how do we, make up that slight difference? And honestly, I feel like the Sharpen just needs a slight buff. I'm not talking huge. I'm literally saying we need to buff up the Sharpen value to the equivalent value of the maces to 3,640. Why? It becomes indifferent. Now then, on one-handed weapons, you divide the difference between the two. So if we were to divide in a two-hand situation, right? So we take the 3,640, and excuse me, I'm just pulling out my calculator right here. Okay. We divide that by 2 for each one-handed. Each one-handed would be an 1820 value. So I'm just saying, I'm like, something's got to happen. If it doesn't, it's going to be insane. It's going to be, everybody's going to be running similar builds on stamina DPS. It's unfortunate, but true. Everybody will have to have either a flat value somewhere derived. And the only flat values you have in penetration, Spriggans, Two Fang, Lover, Sharpen. Those are the only flat values you have. And then you allocate the difference into the CP points. I'm like, it kind of leaves other build options and other sets out of it. That skill hits consistently harder than Dawnbreaker. Yeah. They add Beffoul to that also. Oh, really? Dude! Marty, good looking out, dude. I'm gonna have to look into that. That's good stuff. That's really good stuff, actually. Thanks for the heads up, bro. That's actually awesome. But, yeah, honestly, I was like, if they buff up Sharpen just a tidbit, it would justify the trait for optional use. So even if we get a flat value, right, out of it, and let's say, because now you can take maces and you could use other traits besides Sharpen. So if I use maces and I had a Sharpen bow, then I can go with infused maces, I could go Nirnhold maces, I could go charged maces, I could do a lot more with the maces if the value was indifferent. Don't mind me, I'm just messing around. But I was just like, literally, just something that small would make a huge, huge impact. Massive impact. I think the devs should take it into consideration. I'm not saying the devs should do it. I'm not implying that. But it would go a long way. And it would literally make those values a little bit more manageable for build options. So that's one of my first recommendations. Based on what I'm seeing and just the math, the numbers themselves. So I'm like, it's kind of like, oh my God, this could work. This would work if ZOS was to implement something like this. All right, 1 second here. But yeah, so my first recommendation to ZOS, take a look at indifferent values, especially between, you know, penetration. That's a huge issue right now. I don't have a problem with them nerfing anything or adjusting penetration sets like Night Mothers or Sunder. I just want the indifferent value made up somewhere else along the line. Why? More flexibility towards builds. That's all. Got to go? All right, Josh, you take care, man. Have a good one, brother. So, anyways, I don't know what's going to happen. Like I said, I just wanted to give my feedback because I felt like, okay, in my opinion, the minor fractures should be applied to Night Mothers, and they should readjust the Sunderflame. I agree with all of it. I just don't feel like a four splash damage on a 2H or a single target on a minor fracture isn't going to be worth it, given the fact that the Stamplar already applies minor fracture. The only benefit to a set like that would be the splash damage from a 2H. So giving up AoE effect to a minor fracture now applies something, right? Because how many times are people going to spam Power of Light on mobs? It's not going to happen, right? It's not. So putting minor fracture on Night Mothers makes more sense to me, right? Becomes a lot more doable because it's any damage. It's any critical damage type. It's like, okay, critical damage, apply debuff. Boom, Night Mothers. Can affect multiple targets with AoE effects. That makes sense. Sunderflame, readjust something. Now, let's take a look at the indifferent value for the loss that's going to occur due to our, you know, nerfing these two sets to bring up what? The sharpened trait to an indifferent value of the mace's penetration or destruction staff, or however you want to look at it. Because that becomes relevant, is making up indifferent value. So, recommendation, make up the indifferent value. That's my only major recommendation currently for the poor Stam players, and I play Stam because it's just a problem. You know, when we're taking a look at balancing, you know, it's a teeter-totter anyways, right? So how do you make the easiest adjustment to keep somewhat more balanced and yet make everything a little bit more plausible? Well, that's just simple. Just coming up with the indifferent value. That's it. That's all. I mean, there's nothing even more complicated than that. It's just like we need an indifferent value placed this way. If they don't take maces, the sharpened trait is an equivalent value, or if they do take maces, we see the sharpened trait add an equivalent value, an indifferent, not equivalent, well, yeah, equivalent value of that penetration. This way they don't shorten or extend over and lose DPS, significant amount of DPS. Because if they were to do such, then you wouldn't be so dependent on what? Penetration sets. But then you could use a penetration set, still use other traits other than sharpened, and other modices other than the lover. So that's how you close margins and give more flexibility to build options. You have to find indifferent value. So I'd say bump up the sharpened trait for the 2H to 3,640. Cut the dual wield by the half of the amount, and problem solved. All right, big fix. Though I do recommend that the Night Mothers gets the minor fracture, and Sunderflame does get some other adjustments. The minor fracture on the Sunderflame is not as effective, and it still trashes the set. Same thing with what they're doing with Night Mothers. It's just going to trash it. So at least minor fracture on an AoE effect with Night Mothers would be more manageable, right? Because it's AoE, Power of Light single target. No Stamplar is going to keep applying minor fracture that way. So that becomes a little bit more manageable to say, okay, now we can still use Night Mothers in trial scenarios. We can still use it in dungeons, right? It still has a minor fracture applied to it. It's not a necessity because it's you know, 1,000 and something. Now we can make up the difference, that difference in the CP points if we wanted to. Or we could use the sharpened trait. Or we can use Nernholm. We can use infused. It goes on and on and on just by finding indifferent numbers and closing the gap. Just that simple. So they should do it. Don't know if they will. They wanted feedback. I'm just giving mine. I'm going to wrap this up. But anybody can crunch numbers. You can always crunch numbers. It's a good thing. So there it is, ZOS. There's my recommendation for you guys. I don't know if you'll implement it, but, you know, the math speaks for itself. So, I hope. I can only do, that's all I can do is hope. And no matter what comes to light, I'm still going to play the game. So, I'm not going to rage quit. So, there it is. All right, guys. Thank you guys for watching. If anybody has any questions or comments, especially about the STAM, the sets, what do you think about the finding indifferent value and closing those gaps? Please leave a comment below. I'd like to hear your feedback. All right, guys. Once again and always, Mysticraven, ESO Daily. Have a nice day.